Hello and welcome to the first review of Request Month 2020. This is AMID for PC. This is a first-person shooter developed by Indefatigable and published by New Blood Interactive that was first released into early access in 2018 with the first 3 episodes available, and it was later added to in the following year until eventually you saw the release of the final episode in June of 2019. And as of the time I'm making this video, there's still no word on whether or not the Switch version will actually be coming out this year or if that's just what they're actually planning on doing. So we'll just have to wait and see on that, but as for the game itself, it's generally been very well received since its initial launch into early access, and even more so now that it's a finished product. So let's actually go ahead and start delving right into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here, and see how it holds up compared to other retro throwback shooters, and more importantly, the source material it's drawing from. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation. Now, this game's pretty interesting because it is a retro throwback shooter, which means that it does have that very retro aesthetic of very low poly modeling and rather low res textures, but at the same time, it does run in Unreal Engine 4, and it takes pretty good advantage of some of the features of Unreal Engine 4, mostly in regards to things like the lighting, which is absolutely fantastic. And one of the more interesting tricks they've pulled with that lighting is that all of the first-person weapons are actually not 3D models. They are in fact normal map sprites, which means that they're technically 2D images, but they are still affected by the lighting in the game, which is a really interesting effect, because you get that really pixelated look that you would expect from an actual retro shooter, but at the same time, it's still being affected by the very modern lighting. And speaking of sprites, you will probably notice throughout this video that all of the item pickups are actually sprites as well, but they're not normal mapped like the weapons are, so they don't get affected by the lighting anywhere near as much. Regardless, their combination of modern and old school techniques actually ends up working out very well in the game's favor, and it really does help that the art direction in the game is absolutely phenomenal. You'll be venturing through 7 distinct realms, each one occupying its own individual episode of the game, and every single one of them has their own specific look and feel, and some of those are absolutely stunning at times. Personal favorites as far as aesthetics go are the Forges and the Arcane Expanse, which in the case of the Forges is actually a bit of a shame, but I'll get to that more later on. And I have to say that even with those being my favorites of the bunch, there's not a single bad looking episode in here, and I thoroughly enjoyed the aesthetics throughout. And even aside from all of that, they've made sure that the combat is nice and visceral as far as the visuals go, because this game is fairly gory, even though it's not especially detailed gore, and you'll see enemies getting blasted apart, sliced in half, whatever the case may be with whatever weapons you're using, and it actually does really help out in the gameplay part because you can immediately see when an enemy has been taken out and when you can move on to the next threat. So they've definitely done an absolutely brilliant job with the visuals, but what about the sound design? Well, they've done a very good job there as well. There's barely any voice acting in the game, but what is there is actually done rather well, and then there's the sound effects, which are all very well done, with distinct cues for when you've actually taken out an enemy or you're just hitting them or whatever the case may be, and like with the visual cues, that really does help when you're actually in the middle of combat, but on top of that, they've just done a very good job of making those weapon sounds nice and punchy, even though what you're dealing with here is a bunch of mystical weapons. But then there's the soundtrack, which is actually pretty interesting because it is done by Andrew Hulshult, but it is not actually like his previous works that you're used to. Most of us are used to his more hard rock and metal stuff like you see in the likes of the Rise of the Triad reboot or Dusk, but you don't really get that with AMID. It's a considerably more fantasy-toned soundtrack, and it just works really well for the game in general, although it's certainly not quite as, say, hard-hitting as you would get with the likes of Dusk or Rise of the Triad or something along those lines. Hell, one of the best tracks in the game plays when you enter the Arcane Expanse, and it's a fairly somber piano tune, so not only is it simply interesting seeing Hulshult trying something that's not just metal or industrial or rock, but it's all still damn good music that just works extremely well for the game, and actually ends up proving that he has considerably more range than a lot of people would think. And when you bring everything together, you find that as a retro throwback shooter that's trying to blend old school design principles and techniques with modern technology, they've done a fantastic job as far as presentation goes. But as strong as the presentation is, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although the story means a lot less in this than it does in a lot of other games out there, because this is a retro-styled first first-person shooter, which means that the story is really not much more than setup for what you're actually going to be doing. And the setup here is that the realms have all been corrupted by this ancient, all-consuming evil that it's up to you as the champion to defeat. So you must go through all 6 of the realms and cleanse them of their evil before taking on evil at its source in the void. And that's really all you get here. There's not much in the way of story in this, although there is a bit of lore here and there as you're going through the realms. You'll find some readables that are written on the walls and floors that, as you go near them, then it will tell you what the text says, but there's really not enough to keep you interested in just the story and the lore, so it really falls to the gameplay to hold the entire thing up. So how does the gameplay in this work out? Well, like I said, there are 6 realms you need to go through before you can take on evil in the void, and that means that you'll be going through a series of episodes, each contained within a single realm, and those episodes will be composed of basically a handful of levels, with a level at the end being a boss fight. As I mentioned during my bit about the presentation, each of these realms has their own specific look and feel with their own selection of enemies to boot. And when the game starts off, it'll drop you into the hub world known as the Gateway and allow you to select your difficulty from a selection of easy, medium, hard, and evil. And once you've selected your difficulty, it drops you into the actual hub area where you can go between the various episodes, although it does force you to complete the first 2 episodes before you can go into any of the remaining 4. The first episode you'll encounter is the Astral Equinox, which is themed around the moon, and you can think of it more as kind of a general fantasy vibe. And then the second one is the Domain of the Sentinels, which has been infested by this bizarre parasite creature that reminds me a lot of something like The Thing, so it has an interesting sort of corrupted stone sentinel vibe going on. And then from there, the game opens up and allows you to access any of the 4 remaining episodes in whichever order you wish to complete them. The remaining episodes from there on out are the Sacred Path, which is a very Mesoamerican mixed with Egyptian vibe, as well as the Solar Solstice, which is basically the reverse of the Astral Equinox, where it's themed around the sun, and you basically have swaps of the enemies you fought in the Astral Equinox, but themed around the sun and fire and all that sort of thing. And they also end up throwing in a few extra things here and there that are pretty interesting. And then there's the Forges, which is basically a combination of magic and technology, where everything is some sort of machine. You have enemies that blast lasers at you, things like that. And then finally you have the Arcane Expanse, which is pretty much what you would expect with a name like that, where there's a lot of mages that throw spells at you, as well as various crystalline entities that they've created. And there's a whole lot of vibrant colors, stained glass, all sorts of cool things with regards to the actual level designs in those. And then once you've completed all of those episodes, the Void opens up and allows you to enter, and it sort of defies explanation a bit, so I'm just gonna show you a bit of footage from when you actually step into the Void for the first time and just start wandering around, so I can kind of avoid some spoilers here and there and still give you an idea of what it's like. Throughout all of these episodes, you'll find yourself going up against a pretty wide variety of enemies, from things that just run up and attack you in melee, to things that throw spells at you or just throw general projectiles at you, things that throw exploding projectiles at you, as well as certain enemies that can even reflect your own attacks right back at you. And the developers have done a very good job of introducing these new enemy types in a steady trickle to where you never feel overwhelmed at first when you encounter them, and you feel like you can learn how they actually attack you and what they might be weak against, because certain enemies might be weaker or stronger against certain attacks than others, and they also have their own distinct movement patterns, where certain enemies fly, certain enemies move very quickly along the ground, some of them can lunge at you from a pretty far distance with incredible speed, so you definitely need to be pretty mindful and be very observant as you're going through these levels to make sure that you don't run into enemies and just flub the entire combat encounter, because especially if you're playing on the harder difficulties, they can take you down in pretty short order. Good thing that you'll have a varied selection of weapons available to you throughout the course of the game that will allow you to eviscerate these foes in relatively short order. Now, you do lose all of your weapons except for the Axe of the Black Labyrinth at the beginning of every single episode, but you will be able to get them all back in fairly quick succession, especially once you get to the later episodes, where they generally give you almost all of the weapons, if not all of the weapons, in the first level of that episode. As for what's available, like I said, there's the Axe of the Black Labyrinth, which you start the game with and which you will have throughout your entire journey, and it's an axe which does a surprisingly huge amount of damage, and at short range even pulls enemies in so you can hit them more easily. It's also one of the more interesting weapons when you power it up, because it basically turns into a propeller which will just blitz just about anything in front of you, and if you're underwater then it will make you move quite a lot faster, because it's basically a propeller at that point. That's right, not only do you have each individual weapon by itself, but they all have their own powered up modes where when you activate your soul power, which is a gauge that fills up as you collect the souls of your fallen enemies over the course of the levels, you'll be able to unleash some pretty nasty punishment until the gauge bottoms out and the soul power deactivates, upon which point you will have to continue to collect more souls until you can use it again. Now, I've already touched on the Axe of the Black Labyrinth, but what about the rest of the weapons? Well, the first one you'll get is the Staff of the Azure Orb, which shoots out some homing projectiles that don't do a whole lot of damage, but when soul power is activated, it shoots out a steady stream right in front of you, and that will actually end up turning enemies into water after a while. Next in the lineup is Whisper's Edge, which is a scimitar that shoots out green waves of energy that will impact multiple enemies at once, and if you use the power-up, it shoots out an even wider wave of energy that will actually ricochet off of walls. Next you have the Voltride, which is a trident that shoots out bolts of lightning, and which you can actually overcharge enemies when they hit the point of death, and to the point where if you continue shooting them while they're overcharged, eventually they will explode in a burst of chain lightning that will actually blast anything around them as well. And when you use soul power, it stops shooting bolts from each of the outer prongs of the trident and shoots one really heavily concentrated bolt from the middle of the trident, and it's in a one steady stream, kind of like the lightning gun in Quake, and it does both more damage and continues to do the chain lightning effect, only it's even more powerful. Next you have the game's equivalent of a rocket launcher, which is the Celestial Claw, which is a staff that pulls random planets out of space and time, shrinks them down to a size that can be launched by the staff, and will launch them out as a projectile that explodes on contact with any surface and does area effect damage as well. And when you power it up, it doesn't launch planets anymore, but rather stars that have a much bigger explosive radius, and as a fun little aside, one of the planets it can actually pull out of orbit is Earth. And by the time I got through the game, I actually lost count of the number of times I had launched the Earth at things, which was incredibly amusing. Next in the lineup is the Star of Torment, which is a crystalline mace that launches out a shotgun pattern of crystalline spikes that will be able to impale enemies against walls, and if you power it up, it condenses the spikes into basically one single projectile that actually will home in on things as you're launching it, and not only that, but it launches quite a bit faster. And finally, you have the game's equivalent of the BFG, which is called the Eternum, which, for lack of a better term, looks like a big pink squiggle that launches out pink orbs of electricity that will do massive damage to anything in the vicinity, and if you power it up, it launches black holes at things, which is always fun. And while the axe doesn't use any sort of ammunition whatsoever, the rest of the weapons are powered by one of 4 different types of mana. Blue in the case of the Staff of the Azure Orb and the Voltride, green in the case of Whisper's Edge and the Star of Torment, orange in the case of the Celestial Claw, and purple in the case of the Eternum. Needless to say, you can have quite a lot less of the orange and purple mana, but the green and blue mana are in pretty ready supply, and you'll probably never really run out of them as you continue playing through the game, although there are quite a few fights that will really strain your mana reserves, and when you get to the final boss, well, you're probably going to run out quite a few times. Although you certainly will be able to replenish it during that boss fight anyway. And between the amount of audio-visual feedback you get from all of the weapons, as well as just their effect on target with a lot of enemies just being blasted or sliced apart or whatever the case may be by whatever weapons you're using, they just end up being really satisfying to use. And when you combine the satisfying weapons with the good variety of enemy types and the fast-paced movement with really tight responsive controls that allows you to really get out of the way of enemy attacks and get right into the action when you need to, you end up with an absolutely excellent combat loop in this. And for the vast majority of the game, that's going to be what's going to keep you playing it. It's just really fun to play, until you hit certain parts of the game, at which point it can become downright infuriating. This is primarily a combination of certain aspects of the level design with certain certain enemy types that really exploit that aspect of level design to make the entire experience incredibly irritating. And it's a phenomenon you'll notice the absolute most during the episode known as the Forges, where you have a lot of segments where you're going on some pretty narrow platforms and trying to do some pretty narrow platforming while being assailed by enemies that are able to fly and launch rather large blades at you that have a very large amount of knockback that will probably send you careening off into the pits below, either to just be cooked by whatever the acid-like substance is on the ground, or to fall into a pit and then have to go all the way back through the level in order to get to where you were, or you'll just be assailed by a large number of spike balls that roll on the ground and run right up to you and just start running into you for a rather large amount of damage, and which always travel in packs, or you'll be going up against enemies that have a laser attack, which is actually really difficult to avoid unless you're at a pretty long range. And keep in mind that all of this is occurring over very large pits where there is this acid-like substance which will do a massive amount of damage to you if you fall into it and have to try to find your way out of it, so it can become incredibly obnoxious to deal with. But while it's most prevalent in the Forges and it actually ends up ruining that episode entirely, it is also present in some of the other episodes as well, mostly the later ones in fact, and while it does certainly make the game more difficult, it doesn't really feel like it's a fair difficulty to just throw you into a situation where it's not really your fault that you're taking damage as much as it's just the enemies are placed in just the right way to where you really can't avoid getting hit. Needless to say, the quick save function is a friend that you need to acquaint yourself with very quickly. Although I found that it was really only necessary during the Forges and the Arcane Expanse, those being arguably the toughest episodes in the game, and everything before that I didn't really have much trouble with. As for the level design itself, it's definitely retro in a lot of ways, including things like secret areas where you can get access to certain weapons early, or you can get access to power-ups, which I found were very rare, and the only one I really found was the invisibility power-up, because I don't really count the flight power-up considering it's necessary at certain points to be able to progress, and it only comes up during those sequences. And then I don't really count stuff like full health either, because that bumps your health up all the way to 200, which you can do anyway by just maxing out your health at 100 to begin with, and then just collecting the small health orbs until eventually you get it up to 200. Aside from secret areas, there's also some key hunting you'll need to do, where you'll need to find gold and silver keys in order to progress. You'll have various switch puzzles you need to complete, certain platforming puzzles you'll need to complete, and generally speaking, it's all been done in a very solid manner, although I would say that the platforming puzzles got pretty annoying after a while, but that's mostly because I just don't like platforming in first-person shooters anyway. So your mileage may vary on that, but other than that, there's really not a whole lot to complain about as far as AMID Evil goes. They've done a very good job from start to finish with this thing, from presentation to the gameplay mechanics especially, as well as the level design with the exception of the Forges anyway, and even the boss fights are pretty well done for the most part. It's certainly not perfect. There are a few weird glitches here and there that you might run into, which mostly result in you kind of clipping through environmental objects or something along those lines, but it never really becomes that big of a problem. And the boss fights can be made a bit trivial if you use the powered up Star of Torment, which is just frankly kind of overpowered in general, but it's not really that big of a deal, it's just fun to use anyway. Aside from that, once you finish the single player, there's no multiplayer in this, so you can't go in there for some added replay value. You're mostly just going to be playing through the single player again, maybe on a harder difficulty setting. But that's pretty par for the course with a retro shooter anyway, so it's not really that big of a problem. So if you're a fan of old school first-person shooters, this is an absolute must-own, especially if you're a big fan of Heretic and Hexen, because it definitely gives off especially some Heretic vibes as you're playing through it. But even if you're just a general fan of first-person shooters, you'll probably find a lot to enjoy here. And overall, I give it a 4.5 out of 5. It is easily one of the best games to come out of 2019, and if you haven't already picked up a copy, I very highly recommend you do so. Thank you all very much for watching. And if you like what I do, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent from that goes directly back into the channel in some way or another. But if you can't afford to or don't want to, then that's perfectly fine, I understand. Thank you all again for watching. I'll see you all in later videos.